1958, Chicago. Louis Armstrong lowered his trumpet in the middle of the concert and the orchestra suddenly went silent. 15,000 people held their breath. At the front of the stage, among the audience, a man stood, intoxicated, angry, shouting, "You're fake, Satchmo! That smile is a lie! You're one of us, but you act like them!" The man was drunk, his words were slurred, but that famous smile disappeared from Louis's face. For the first time, thousands of people saw Louis Armstrong without a smile. And Louis walked toward the microphone, set his trumpet aside, and began to speak. "You're right, I've been fake, but today I'm going to show you the truth." What Louis Armstrong did that night changed not just a concert, but one man's life. So what did Louis do to that drunk man? And why did 15,000 people end up in tears? The answer reveals one of the most beautiful moments of compassion in music history, a moment when a legend chose vulnerability over performance and humanity over fame. If this story has captured your attention, please subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover shows why Louis Armstrong was more than just a musician. He was a teacher of empathy who understood that sometimes the greatest performances happen when you stop performing. 4 weeks before that legendary night in Chicago, Louis Armstrong sat in his dressing room after a concert in New York City, staring at his reflection in the mirror and barely recognizing himself. At 57 years old, Louis had been performing professionally for 40 years. He was one of the most famous musicians in the world, beloved by millions, respected by his peers, financially successful beyond what that hungry kid from New Orleans could have ever imagined. But Louis felt empty. For months, something had been eating at him, a growing sense that he had lost himself somewhere along the way, that the public Louis Armstrong had consumed the private Louis, that Satchmo the entertainer had killed Louis the person. And Louis didn't know how to get himself back. The trigger had been an article published in a black newspaper 3 weeks earlier, written by a younger activist who accused Louis of being an Uncle Tom, of entertaining white audiences while his own people struggled for civil rights, of smiling and grinning when he should be angry and demanding justice. The article had been harsh and personal, questioning not just Louis's choices but his character, his integrity, his commitment to his community. Louis had read it alone in his hotel room and felt something crack inside him. Because the worst part was that some of it was true, or at least Louis feared it might be true. He had spent decades being careful, being diplomatic, being the smiling ambassador of jazz who never made white audiences uncomfortable, who always stayed cheerful and non-threatening. And Louis had told himself this was strategic, that by being successful and beloved he was opening doors for other black artists. That representation mattered, that showing white America that black people could be talented and dignified and worthy of respect was its own form of activism. But lately, Louis had started questioning those justifications. The civil rights movement was heating up. Montgomery bus boycott, Little Rock crisis, sit-ins and protests across the South. Young black activists were risking their lives to demand equality, refusing to smile or accommodate or make white people comfortable. And what was Louis Armstrong doing? Entertaining in segregated venues, playing nice, smiling that famous smile even when he was hurting inside. The guilt was consuming him. Louis had spoken out about Little Rock in 1957, had publicly criticized President Eisenhower, had shown that he could be brave and outspoken when pushed. But one moment of courage didn't erase years of accommodation, and Louis knew it. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. 2 weeks before the Chicago concert, Louis had a conversation with his wife, Lucille, that brought everything to a head. They were at home in Corona, Queens, and Louis was sitting quietly in his study, lost in thought, barely responding to Lucille's attempts at conversation. Finally, Lucille sat down across from him and said gently, "Louis, what's wrong? You've been distant for weeks. Talk to me." Louis tried to brush it off, said he was just tired, just getting old, nothing to worry about. But Lucille wasn't buying it. She had been married to Louis for 16 years. She knew when something was really bothering him. She pressed harder. "Is this about that article? The one calling you an Uncle Tom?" Louis flinched at the words. "I don't want to talk about it," he said quietly. But Lucille persisted. "You have to talk about it, Louis. It's eating you alive. I can see it." So Louis finally opened up, and everything came pouring out, all the guilt, all the doubt, all the fear that maybe he had sold out, maybe he had chosen comfort over courage, maybe that smile everyone loved was just cowardice dressed up as diplomacy. "I've been thinking about my mother," Louis said, his voice breaking slightly. "Mary Ann worked herself to death cleaning white people's houses so I could survive. She never smiled at them unless she had to. She never made herself smaller to make them comfortable. She just did what she had to do and maintained her dignity. And what did I do? I smiled, I grinned, I played the happy entertainer. Did I betray her? Did I betray everyone who struggled so I could have a chance?" Lucille listened quietly, then said something that would echo in Louis's mind for the next 2 weeks. "Louis, you've spent 40 years worrying about what everyone else needs from you. Maybe it's time to figure out what you need from yourself." The week before the Chicago concert, Louis started having nightmares, vivid, disturbing dreams where he was back in New Orleans, a child again, and his mother, Mary Ann, was looking at him with disappointment, saying, "I raised you to be strong, not safe." Louis would wake up in cold sweats, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that he had failed some fundamental test of character. During the day, Louis found himself going through the motions of his performances mechanically, without joy. The smile was still there. Muscle memory made it appear on cue, but Louis felt like he was watching himself from outside his body, seeing this performer named Satchmo go through familiar routines while the real Louis stood in the shadows, silent and invisible. The audiences didn't notice anything wrong. They cheered, they applauded, they told Louis afterward how much joy his music brought them. But Louis felt like a fraud. 3 days before Chicago, Louis made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He told his manager Joe Glaser that he wanted to add something new to the Chicago concert. Not a new song, but a moment of honesty. A brief speech where Louis would talk about his journey, his struggles, maybe address some of the criticism he'd been receiving. Joe was immediately opposed. "Louis, you don't owe anyone explanations. You're Louis Armstrong. You've earned the right to just play music and not get into politics or controversy. Besides, audiences come to be entertained, not to hear about your personal struggles." But Louis was insistent, more insistent than Joe had seen him in years. "I need to do this, Joe. I don't know exactly what I'm going to say yet, but I need to be real with people. I need to stop hiding behind the smile." Joe reluctantly agreed, though he warned Louis that this could backfire, could alienate audiences who just wanted happy Satchmo, not complicated, vulnerable Louis. "Do you think artists have a responsibility to show their real selves, or is it okay to maintain a public persona?" Share your thoughts in the comments. The night before the Chicago concert, Louis barely slept. He kept thinking about what he might say, how he might explain the contradiction of being Louis Armstrong, beloved entertainer and struggling human, successful artist and guilty conscience, symbol of black excellence and target of black criticism. Louis thought about all the moments in his career when he had bitten his tongue, swallowed anger, maintained composure when he wanted to scream. He thought about performing in venues where he couldn't use the front door, eating in the kitchen while white patrons dined, in the restaurant staying in separate hotels from his white band members, smiling through all of it because that was the price of success for a black man in America. And Louis wondered, was the price too high? Had he paid for success with his soul? That day in Chicago, Louis walked through the city alone, something he rarely did anymore. Fame made solitude difficult, but Louis needed time to think, needed to be just a person walking streets, not Satchmo the legend. He found himself in the South Side, the black neighborhood where jazz clubs thrived and people knew Louis's music, even if they didn't always approve of his choices. Louis stopped at a small club where a young musician was practicing, and he listened from the doorway. The kid was maybe 20, playing trumpet with raw enthusiasm but limited technique. When the young man noticed Louis standing there, he froze, starstruck. "Mr. Armstrong, I didn't know you were here. I'm sorry, I know I'm not very good yet." Louis shook his head and said gently, "Don't apologize for learning. That's how we all started, making mistakes, finding our voice. Just keep playing." But then the young musician said something that hit Louis hard. "Mr. Armstrong, can I ask you something? How did you keep going when people told you weren't good enough? When they told you to stop, to give up?" Louis thought about it carefully before answering. "I kept going because I didn't have a choice. Music was the only thing I had, the only thing that made sense. But you know what? I wish I had been braver. I wish I had been more honest about the struggle, about the pain. Maybe that would have helped other people who were struggling too." The young musician looked confused. "But you're Louis Armstrong. You made it. You succeeded. What do you have to regret?" Louis smiled sadly. "Success doesn't mean you did everything right. It just means you survived. And sometimes survival requires compromises that haunt you later." If you're feeling moved by Louis's internal struggle, please subscribe. His moment of truth on stage is coming, and it's more powerful than you can imagine. That evening, Louis arrived at the Chicago Theater for the concert feeling strangely calm, like he had finally made peace with something he'd been avoiding for years. He didn't have a script planned, didn't know exactly what he would say if the moment came, but Louis knew he was ready to be honest in a way he had never been on stage before. The theater was packed, 15,000 people eager to see the legendary Satchmo perform. As Louis prepared backstage, he could hear the audience's anticipation, their excitement, their expectation of joy and entertainment. And for a moment, Louis almost chickened out. Maybe Joe was right. Maybe these people just wanted happy music, not complicated truths. Maybe Louis should just give them what they expected and deal with his crisis of conscience privately. But then Louis remembered something his mother Mary Ann had told him when he was young. "Baby, the hardest thing in life is being yourself when everyone wants you to be something else." Mary Ann had been talking about surviving in a racist world, about maintaining dignity when others wanted to strip it away. But Louis realized her words applied to his current situation too. Everyone wanted Satchmo, the smile, the showmanship, the joy. But Louis needed to be Louis, complicated, struggling, human. So when Louis walked onto that stage in Chicago, he carried with him not just his trumpet, but a quiet determination to tell the truth if the opportunity presented itself. He didn't know that opportunity would come sooner and more dramatically than he could have imagined. The concert started normally. Louis played "When the Saints Go Marching In," then "Mac the Knife," then several other crowd favorites. The audience was loving it, dancing in their seats, singing along, applauding enthusiastically. Louis was on autopilot, playing the notes perfectly, but feeling distant from the performance, like he was watching himself from far away. Then, about 40 minutes into the show, as Louis began playing "What a Wonderful World," something shifted in the crowd. There was a disturbance near the front, someone standing up, moving toward the stage. Security started moving to intercept, but the man's voice cut through the music before they could reach him. "Liar! You're a liar, Satchmo!" The orchestra faltered, unsure what to do. Louis kept playing, pretending not to hear, maintaining that famous smile. But the man kept shouting, "That smile is fake! You sing about a wonderful world while we're dying in the streets. You're one of us, but you dance for them." And that's when Louis Armstrong did something he had never done in 40 years of performing. He stopped playing mid-song. He lowered his trumpet, and the orchestra, confused and uncertain, gradually fell silent. 15,000 people froze, unsure what was happening. The drunk man at the front of the stage, emboldened by Louis's attention, continued shouting, "You sold out! You smile and grin for white people while our children are getting attacked by dogs in Birmingham. Where's your anger, Satchmo? Where's your pain?" Security guards rushed toward the man to remove him, but Louis raised his hand and stopped them. Then Louis did something that shocked everyone. He spoke into the microphone, his voice quiet but clear, without a trace of the jovial Satchmo persona. "You're right." Those two words, "You're right," sent a ripple of shock through the entire theater. People gasped, murmured, exchanged confused glances. What was happening? Was Louis Armstrong agreeing with a drunk Heckler? Louis set his trumpet down on a stool, walked to the front of the stage, and looked directly at the man who had been shouting. "What's your name?" Louis asked quietly. The man, surprised by Louis's calm response, stammered, "Robert. Robert Hayes." Louis nodded. "Robert, you said I'm fake. You said my smile is a lie, and you're right. I've been lying for 40 years. Not about loving music, that's real, but about being okay, about everything being wonderful, about this world being a place where people like us can just smile and play music and everything works out fine." The theater was dead silent now, everyone hanging on Louis's words. This wasn't the Satchmo they knew. This was someone else entirely. Someone raw, honest, vulnerable. Louis continued, his voice getting stronger. "I grew up in the poorest part of New Orleans. My mother cleaned white people's houses for pennies. I went to bed hungry most nights. I learned to play music in a home for troubled boys. That's a nice way of saying jail for kids who had nowhere else to go. And when I started performing, I learned real quick that the only way to survive was to smile. Smile when they won't let you in the front door. Smile when they make you eat in the kitchen. Smile when they pay you half what they pay white musicians. Smile, 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 because if you show anger, if you show pain, they'll replace you with someone who will smile." Robert Hayes, the drunk man at the front, had stopped shouting. He was just staring at Louis, tears starting to form in his eyes. Louis wasn't finished. "So, yes, Robert, I've been fake. I've hidden my pain behind a smile because that's how I survived. But you know what? I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending everything is wonderful when it's not. I'm tired of being Satchmo when I need to just be Louis." Louis paused, took a deep breath, and then said something that would echo through music history. "You called me out, Robert. You demanded truth. So here's my truth. I don't have all the answers. I don't know if I've lived my life the right way. I don't know if smiling was cowardice or strategy. I don't know if I've helped my people or betrayed them. All I know is that I'm human, I'm flawed, and I'm trying." The audience was completely silent, many people visibly crying. This level of vulnerability from a major star was unprecedented in 1958. Performers didn't break down on stage. They didn't admit weakness or doubt. They certainly didn't validate hecklers and agree they'd been living a lie. But Louis wasn't done yet. He looked at Robert Hayes and said, "Robert, come up on stage." Robert looked confused, almost scared. "What?" Louis gestured. "Come up here, I want to show you something." Security guards looked at Louis uncertainly, but he nodded that it was okay. Slowly, hesitantly, Robert Hayes climbed onto the stage. He was unsteady on his feet, still clearly intoxicated, but the anger had left his eyes. Now there was just confusion and vulnerability. Louis picked up his trumpet and held it out to Robert. "Have you ever played trumpet?" Robert shook his head. "Never. I don't know anything about music." Louis smiled. A real smile this time. Not the Satchmo grin, but something gentler and more genuine. "That's okay. I'm going to teach you one note. Just one. And you're going to play it for these 15,000 people." Robert looked terrified. "Mr. Armstrong, I can't. I'm drunk. I don't know how. I'll mess it up." Louis put a hand on Robert's shoulder. "Robert, you just stood in front of 15,000 people and called me a liar and a sellout. Playing one note on a trumpet is nothing compared to that. You've already shown more courage tonight than most people show in a lifetime." Louis positioned the trumpet at Robert's lips and showed him how to hold it, where to put his fingers, how to form his mouth. "Now blow. Just blow air through the horn. Don't worry about making it sound good. Just make it sound." Robert took a shaky breath and blew. A terrible, squawking noise came out of the trumpet, completely off-key, painfully loud, technically awful. But Louis started clapping. Then the orchestra started clapping. Then, incredibly, the entire audience of 15,000 people began applauding. Robert looked around in shock, tears now streaming freely down his face. I don't understand. That sounded terrible." Louis smiled at him. "That sounded like truth, Robert. That sounded like someone being brave enough to try something even when they don't know how. That sounded like someone being real instead of fake." Then Louis turned to the audience and spoke into the microphone again. "This is what I should have been doing all along. Not just performing, teaching, sharing, being honest. Robert came here angry because he thought I'd forgotten where I came from. But the truth is I never forgot. I just stopped talking about it. I stopped showing the struggle. I only showed the success. And that's a lie, too, just a different kind of lie." Louis turned back to Robert. Robert, why are you angry? What's really going on? Robert, still holding the trumpet, broke down completely. My son wants to be a musician, but I keep telling him it's impossible, that people like us don't get those chances, that he should be realistic. And then I see you on stage, Louis Armstrong, and I get angry because you made it, but you don't talk about how hard it was. You just smile like it was easy. And I need to know, was it worth it? Is my son going to have to smile through hell like you did? Louis was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would later be quoted in countless articles and books about that night. Your son is going to face things you and I can't even imagine, good things and hard things. But if music is what he loves, don't take it away from him because you're scared. My mother was terrified for me. She knew how hard life would be for a black musician. But she let me try because she knew music was my only chance at a life that meant something. Tell your son the truth. It will be hard. He will face rejection, discrimination, exhaustion. But if he can create beauty in an ugly world, if he can make people feel something, if he can turn pain into art, that's worth everything. That's what makes a wonderful world, Robert. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of people brave enough to create joy despite the struggle. The theater erupted in applause, not the polite applause of a good performance, but the thunderous, emotional applause of people who had just witnessed something profound and true. Robert Hayes was sobbing openly now, still holding Louis's trumpet like it was the most precious thing he'd ever touched. Louis put his arm around Robert's shoulders and spoke to him quietly, though the microphone picked it up. Keep the trumpet, Robert. Give it to your son. And tell him Louis Armstrong said he's already good enough, he just needs to practice becoming himself. Robert tried to protest. This was Louis Armstrong's personal trumpet, probably worth thousands of dollars, a piece of music history, but Louis was firm. I have other trumpets. Your son needs this one more than I do. As security gently helped Robert off the stage, Louis turned back to the audience. I'm sorry for stopping the concert. I know you came here to be entertained, to forget your problems for a while, and I promise we're going to finish the show. But I needed this moment. I needed to stop pretending everything is wonderful and admit that it's complicated. I needed to stop being Satchmo for a minute and just be Louis. Louis picked up another trumpet from his collection backstage and returned to the microphone. Now I'm going to play What a Wonderful World again, but this time I'm playing it different. Not as a lie about how perfect everything is, but as a hope for what things could be. As a reminder that even in darkness we can choose to see light. Even in struggle we can create beauty. That's what makes the world wonderful, not that it's perfect, but that we're all in it together trying to make it better. The performance of What a Wonderful World that followed was unlike any Louis had ever given. He played it slower, with more pain in the notes, letting the sorrow show through alongside the hope. And when he sang the lyrics, I see trees of green, red roses too, I see them bloom for me and you. His voice cracked with emotion because he wasn't just singing words anymore, he was singing truth. Every person in that audience felt it. Many were crying openly, because Louis wasn't entertaining them anymore. He was sharing his humanity with them, inviting them into his struggle, showing them that even legends are just people trying to figure out how to live with integrity. The story of what happened at the Chicago Theater that night in 1958 spread quickly. Newspapers covered it, though many couldn't quite capture what had made it so powerful. Louis Armstrong stops concert to confront Heckler, read one headline, which was technically accurate but missed the entire point. This wasn't about confrontation, it was about connection. It was about a moment when performance stopped and truth began, when a legend chose vulnerability over image, when someone with everything to lose risked it all for an honest conversation with a stranger. But the real story was what happened to Robert Hayes and his family after that night. Robert sobered up, got help for his drinking, and started rebuilding his relationship with his son Marcus. Marcus Hayes, who had been 14 years old at the time and hadn't attended the concert, received Louis Armstrong's trumpet from his father with a note that read, Louis Armstrong says you're already good enough. Prove him right. Marcus practiced every day, attended music school, and eventually became a respected jazz musician himself, always telling the story of the trumpet his father received from Louis Armstrong on the night everything changed. Marcus would say in interviews years later, "My father went to that concert angry and drunk and planning to cause trouble. He left sober, forgiven, and holding a gift from the man he'd been insulting." That's the kind of person Louis Armstrong was, someone who saw beyond the anger to the pain underneath, who responded to attack with empathy. For Louis Armstrong, that night in Chicago became a turning point. He started incorporating moments of honesty into his performances, sometimes stopping between songs to talk about the real struggles of being a black artist in America, about the compromises he'd made, about the complexity of loving music while hating the systems that restricted who could play it and who could hear it. Some audiences didn't like this new approach. They wanted happy Satchmo, not complicated Louis. But other audiences, especially younger audiences, especially black audiences, felt like they were finally seeing the real person behind the legend. And Louis discovered that being honest, being vulnerable, being imperfect actually connected him more deeply with people than any perfect performance ever had. Louis remained in touch with Robert Hayes and his family for the rest of his life. He attended Marcus Hayes' first major concert performance in 1965, sitting in the audience instead of on stage, just another proud supporter watching a young musician find his voice. After the show, Louis went backstage to congratulate Marcus, and the young man asked him the same question his father had asked 7 years earlier. "Mr. Armstrong, was it worth it? All the struggle, all the compromise, all the times you had to smile when you wanted to scream, was it worth it?" Louis thought about it carefully, then answered with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades grappling with that exact question. "That's the wrong question, Marcus. It's not about whether it was worth it. It's about whether I did the best I could with what I had. I made mistakes. I compromised when maybe I shouldn't have. But I also survived. I created beauty, and I tried, not always successfully, but I tried to help others along the way. That's all any of us can do. Not be perfect, just be honest and keep trying to be better." The trumpet Louis gave to Robert Hayes that night became a symbol in the jazz community of what music should be. Not just entertainment, not just technical skill, but connection, empathy, honesty. When Marcus Hayes eventually donated the trumpet to the Smithsonian in 2005, he included a letter that read, "This trumpet represents the moment when Louis Armstrong taught my father and 15,000 other people that true strength isn't about hiding your struggles. It's about sharing them. My father went to that concert to tear down a legend. He left with a gift from a man who chose to see his humanity instead of his anger. This trumpet changed our family. It probably saved my father's life. And it taught me that the greatest artists aren't the ones who play the perfect notes. They're the ones who play true notes." Today, more than 60 years after that night at the Chicago Theater, the story remains one of music history's most powerful reminders of what art is really for. Not to create perfect performances, not to maintain comfortable illusions, but to forge genuine human connections, to bridge the gaps between people, to transform anger into understanding and pain into empathy. Louis Armstrong stopped a concert, admitted he'd been hiding behind a smile for 40 years, and gave his trumpet to a drunk heckler who called him a sellout. Any other performer would have had security throw that man out. Any other celebrity would have dismissed the confrontation and continued with the show. But Louis made a different choice, the choice that defined his legacy more than any of his famous recordings. That night, Louis Armstrong taught 15,000 people, and eventually millions more who heard the story, that vulnerability is not weakness. Admitting doubt is not failure. Showing your humanity is not unprofessional. In fact, the opposite is true. True strength comes from being honest about your struggles. True connection comes from letting people see the person behind the performance. True art comes from telling the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Louis had spent 40 years being Satchmo, the smiling entertainer, the ambassador of jazz, the legend who made everything look easy. But that night in Chicago, he chose to be Louis, complicated, struggling, doubting, human. And in doing so, he gave everyone permission to be human too, to acknowledge their own struggles, to stop pretending everything is wonderful and start creating something genuinely meaningful. The drunk heckler who challenged Louis Armstrong on stage thought he was exposing a fraud. What he actually did was free a legend from a prison of expectations. Robert Hayes came to that concert angry at Louis Armstrong for not being militant enough, for not showing enough pain, for hiding behind a smile. But what Robert learned, what everyone learned that night, was that Louis had been carrying pain all along. He had just been carrying it quietly, privately, bearing the weight alone because that's what he thought was required of him. And when Louis finally set that weight down, when he finally admitted that yes, the smile was sometimes fake, and yes, he had doubts, and yes, he didn't have all the answers, that's when he became truly great. Not great as a performer, but great as a human being willing to be honest, to be vulnerable, to use his platform not for self-promotion, but for genuine connection. Louis Armstrong died in 1971, 13 years after that night in Chicago. His obituaries talked about his groundbreaking recordings, his influence on jazz, his status as an American icon. But those who had been at the Chicago theater that night remembered something else. They remembered the moment when a legend stopped performing and started teaching, when Satchmo disappeared and Louis emerged, when a drunk heckler received grace instead of judgment and a trumpet instead of rejection. That's the Louis Armstrong who mattered most. Not the one who played perfect notes, but the one who played true ones. Not the one who hid his struggles, but the one who shared them. Not the one who smiled to make others comfortable, but the one who finally chose honesty over image, even when it risked everything he had built. On that night in 1958, 15,000 people came to a concert expecting entertainment. What they got instead was transformation, a reminder that we're all struggling, all doubting, all trying to figure out how to be genuine in a world that often rewards fakeness. Louis Armstrong, in stopping his concert to confront a heckler with honesty instead of anger, taught everyone present that the most powerful thing we can do is see the humanity in people who attack us, respond to pain with empathy, and choose connection over conflict. That drunk man shouting from the audience didn't see a legend. He saw a symbol of everything he thought was wrong. And Louis, instead of defending himself or maintaining his image, chose to be human with him, to share his own doubts and struggles, to transform a moment of conflict into a moment of profound connection. That's what made Louis Armstrong truly legendary. Not the music, though. The music was extraordinary. It was the humanity underneath the performance, the willingness to be vulnerable, the courage to admit weakness, and the generosity to give his trumpet to a stranger who moments earlier had been calling him a sellout. Those are the moments that define us. Not when everything goes right, but when everything goes wrong, and we choose grace anyway. Not when people love us, but when they challenge us and we choose to listen instead of defend. Not when we're perfect, but when we're honest about being imperfect, and that honesty creates space for others to be imperfect too. Louis Armstrong, on that night in Chicago, showed 15,000 people what it really means to be wonderful in a world that isn't always wonderful, to create beauty despite pain, to choose empathy despite anger, to be human despite being a legend. And that lesson still echoes today, more than 6 decades later, reminding us all that the greatest performances aren't on stages, they're in moments of honest human connection.